I got to clean up a few loose ends from last week. I listened to the feed this morning and I caught myself making a couple of mistakes. These are my quick notes. Oh yeah. These are the seven, I mentioned the seven churches of Asia Minor from Revelation, and I included Colossae. But Colossae was not one of the seven churches of Asia Minor mentioned in Revelation. So really there were 8 churches of Asia Minor that we know of. When Luke says in Acts that all Asia heard the word of God, it's a very summary statement. And it's in the absence of any recorded ministry in any place other than Ephesus. You know, when he recorded his reporting on the first journey through Galatia was very thorough, step by step. You know, he lands, they go to Perga, then they go to, there's Lycia, Lydia, Pisidian Antioch, Derbe, and then back to the backwards all the way around, Cyprus. A very, very detailed reporting. And it's kind of the same thing on the second journey with down through Achaia Macedonia and then Achaia, with Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Antioch, Corinth, and then the journey back. He's very, very detailed. But when he does the third journey, he seems to only care about what happened at Ephesus. And he just sums up everything else with all of Asia heard the word of God. Well, it turns out all of Asia, whoa, did I do that? What am I doing? All of Asia is actually the most comprehensive coverage of the gospel. He just doesn't report it. You hear about the churches in Revelation, and we see the letter to Colossae, the church in Colossae. But that's what it looks like in Asia. It's pretty thorough. So we're going to get back to that as we finish chapter 16, because Colossae is going to matter. So here's Ephesus, and here's Colossae. The ones in yellow are the 7 churches reported in Revelation, and then there's Colossae.
Yeah, I remember Colossae too, the church you never visited.
We're going to talk about that. So that raises some interesting questions about Paul's relationship with that church, with the Colossian church, especially given the name list that we'll see from people who are in Rome when Paul writes Philemon. That's the way I'm going to say it, because I looked it up in Greek again, and it seems to be, I'll just say Philemon like everybody else, but Philemon, in the book of Philemon, who's the slave. But you look at the name list at the end of that book, and it's very interesting. So we'll get back to all that if we get the time. Anyway, that's number 1. Oh, I also said that in chapter 16 of Romans, the word for teaching right here, I implied or led you to believe that it was the word that we translate catechism. It wasn't. I was wrong about that. It's didache. Where is it? Where's the teaching word? There it is right there. It's didache. The other word. It doesn't matter. I just want to correct myself in case any of this gets back to Doug Moo down at wherever he is now, that I got it wrong or something. Or any other high-minded scholar who might hear about what I'm doing in this Sunday school class. And then let's see. Oh, let me pick up to was it Vic's point about audio Bibles. He said something about it last week. I think it had more value than I gave it credence. There are a wealth of tools out there online to listen to the Bible. It's free. For example, Bible Gateway. I have a subscription, but you don't need a subscription to listen to the Bible. And on this, for example, I don't know why it says read, but these audio Bibles, basically, I don't know why it always picks dramatized. I never listen to it, but look at all these different audio Bibles. I usually listen to this one. I mean, if I get my choice, I'm listening to Alexander Scourby from the 70s doing the King James, because there's just simply nothing like it, which is why it's not on this list. You don't just get to get that one wherever you want. But yeah, so did I. Yeah. Records? Really? LPs? Wow. Yeah, I've had that on CDs and DVDs and Anyway, that's a plug for the idea of audio Bibles. And then lastly, we did a summary, which I listened to, I thought was pretty good, on what basically the ever shifting, mutating morality of our age, moving and moving and moving. And I went through this stuff about how, back during the Middle Ages and before, there was kind of a single guiding religious narrative for Western civilization. And that got overthrown. We talked about that. And then what replaced it was sort of a scientific narrative where you're not studying a creation, you're studying a physical world, a mechanistic physical world, materialistic physical world, without remainder, without anything else to explain, without a God who imposes himself. So the scientific the tools therefore available, the sky's the limit. Whatever tools science can come up with to study the physical order, that is the limitation to your knowledge of the physical universe. And so with ever better tools of science, you get a more thorough study of the physical order. If you have a religious narrative, there are things beyond the scope of your even possible understanding of the created order. And in the mechanistic view, there is no study of a moral order because there is no such thing. And so there are no scientific tools for studying. That's psychology. That's the psychological sciences study moral frameworks, mores, moral values, and so forth, because there is no such thing in the physical realm of moral facts of the matter, of a moral reality. And so there are no common points of reference for morality. No two people can sit and argue about an external moral fact of the matter, like, is adultery wrong? If you believe adultery is wrong, then you believe adultery is wrong. You have not discovered a moral or tapped into the presence of a moral reality, which has within it, like it has mathematical equations and physical laws, a moral principle about adultery or murder or anything else. Those don't exist. That's the scientific world. Then we moved on to, so that would be like modernity. So you have pre-modernity, which is pre-enlightenment, which is the Middle Ages and so forth, the religious narrative. Then you have modernity, where secularism overthrows the religious narrative. And we have a very optimistic approach, hopeful approach about the future, because science can solve so many of our problems through the things that it discovers and engineers can make, which produced instead weapons of war after which we lived through the bloodiest century in the history of humanity, where you can't count the tens of millions. They argue in the tens of millions. Did Joseph Stalin kill 60 million or 40 million? Did Mao Zedong kill 60 million or 40 million or 20 million? Did Pol Pot kill 1 million or 1.5 or 2 million people of his own citizens? You end up at the scale is like that. That's what modernity gave us, which then brings us to post-modernity, which becomes pessimistic about what science can do, which then subverts all narratives, which leaves you in very precarious territory as far as your own personal identity, which didn't work either. We now live in post-modernity, where that has been overthrown, been replaced, not overthrown, but replaced with, this is the new part that I didn't mention last week, identity politics. You are part of a group. You have a group identity, and that group's identity defines you as the individual. And so everything then becomes about your identity, gender identity, racial identity, sexual identity, probably more of them. And some of those are fluid. Gender identity is fluid. No boundaries, no limits, no constraints. Transitions. Sexual identity is fluid. But when you cannot decide your racial identity. That is given to you. And once that is decided for you, if you don't fit what the prevailing orthodoxy is about that racial identity, then you transgress. You have to fall in line with that. You have to fit that that profile, that whatever you want to think of it, the higher ups, however this happens, it gets handed down to you. And then you decide your gender identity, you decide your sexual identity, LGBTQ, which keeps changing and changing and changing and so forth. That's where we are now. The fluidity of individual identity under the constraints of group identity, some of which is handed down to you that you cannot overcome. And that's where we are. And it's a gigantic mess that's only getting worse.
Our identity is in Jesus.
Then there's Christian identity in Christ, through faith, that identity. And all other elements of identity don't disappear. It's not like I don't have any individual identity, but my identity is now sort of become captivated by my identity in Christ. My identity in Christ is the most important thing about me. Period. And that's another thing that will remain. The world out there with the morality of the current year will be mortally opposed to forever. That's just the way it is. So that's all of that. You didn't ask for any of that, but I gave it to you anyway. Really, that's a whole summer, which I would love to do again, if anybody's interested. The students back in the 90s at Michigan State used to love this stuff because they read themselves into it, and the hands go up because, they're processing their own interaction, the conversations in the dorm and so on and so forth. They just hear that stuff all the time. So we'll talk about that later. Anybody want to say anything about all that?
Well, so when I'm sharing the gospel, or when we are, I should say, one thing that the people that are hearing this might be thinking is about this identity stuff and what they've been hearing about Christians. And so they might respond differently to the presentation of the gospel.
Yeah, well, you'll I'm sorry to interrupt you. Keep going.
Than they would have before all this identity stuff became promoted.
Well, once the religious narrative got subverted, exiled, whatever you want to call it, you could no longer appeal to it. But back in the day, you could disagree within the constraints of the religious narrative. And back in the modernist, the days of modernity, you could disagree within the constraints that the secular framework allowed, as long as you were disagreeing according to the rules of secularism. With postmodernity, when everything becomes subjective and privatized, morality, truth, value, reality, everything becomes privatized. Well, that's your reality and your truth and your morality, and those are your values. They don't say anything about mine. I might choose some of yours, but I don't have. There are no constraints on me external to me as I decide my own value set about the world. What they don't understand is there absolutely are constraints, and they are imposed upon you from the outside. And if you think that's wrong, head on up to Twitter or Facebook and post the wrong thing and watch what happens. If you think there's no constraints, you think you're autonomous, you think you're sovereign over your own identity. You absolutely are not. There's always somebody coming in to fill the vacuum of power. And when you remove a religious narrative and even a modernist secular narrative, that creates a power vacuum, and in rushes the forces to control. And they will dictate to you, you are thus and such. You are a straight, white, cis, normal male. That's a pejorative term in their thinking. That's a pejorative term. And you cannot transcend that identity. And if you try to transcend it, head on up to Twitter or Facebook and give it a try and see what happens.
You can't even say your color.
You can't say, well, I don't see race. I don't pay attention. You can't say that. No, yeah.
That's considered.
And it's ruthlessly orthodox. It's ruthlessly orthodox and authoritarian. They just don't think of it that way.
Yeah. So if you're sharing the gospel with somebody, especially in the larger group, it makes a difference if it's one or two, three people or half a dozen.
Yeah.
You know, because people are thinking about the other people that are listening in. But then as people are hearing more and more hatred towards the Bible and towards Christians and towards God, I think that they're going to be more reserved about listening. But if they see something in us that's attractive to them, and they're wondering what's causing this, and that kind of
I think that my experience in the 90s at Michigan State was that the hostility to the Bible is few and far between. Most people, they just know that they just don't want trouble, so they just shut up. But deep down inside, like I've sat in many forums, hundreds of people, and I talk exactly like I'm doing now. And when that forum ended, students coming up to talk. Something just clicks. It's in there. They just, people are religious. They really are. They've been browbeaten about it, and they don't want to. You can see it on interviews on TV. People when they're doing man on the street interview about something, you be very careful to not say the wrong thing, because if they say the wrong thing, they know what's coming, even sometimes by their own friends, because everybody wants to conform to the orthodoxy. There is no such thing as nonconformity. We're the nonconformists. The Christians are the nonconformists.
to an extent.
The conformist is that world, that information net out there, from Facebook to Twitter. I keep picking on them. Twitter, although Twitter's is mutating, is changing a little bit. Apple, Google, search results. Go try that. Type in different search results, and suddenly Google doesn't know so much about what you want. Just a minute ago, man, it could predict exactly what, but all of a sudden, they used to play games with this during the election, the 2016 election. Type in Hillary Clinton age, Hillary Clinton husband, you type all these things in. Hillary Clinton medical, no results, because there was this thing going around that she had a medical problem during the election. Remember that? She almost collapsed a couple times.
Right.
Yeah. So you couldn't get search results on it. And people began playing games with this, and they started doing these searches. Yeah. They manipulate the algorithm. It's to shift the control. That's authoritarian. You just don't see it. The whole point is for you to not see it. You don't even know what's happening. That's the point. But anyway, back to Vic's point. With these students, you start talking, and you start talking about the Bible and so forth, and you can see people very, very rarely, maybe never, did I get hostility. And I was on the beach at Hampton Beach, New Hampshire, and Ocean City, New Jersey, talking to these people. And these are college students and high school students on the beach during spring or during the summer. It's like been drinking, and there was no hostility. It just wasn't there. It's a lie. It's false. It's meant to present this narrative. It's meant to, the world out there is meant to present a world in which you are simply, what's the right word? You're an outcast and nobody wants you. That's false. That's false. Not true. All you have to do is go out and talk to people. Every once in a while, you'll encounter somebody, but it's few and far between, by my experience, few and far between.
Well, they'll find that instance and they will publish that.
Yes.
Instance and make it sound like it's everybody.
Yes, and a swarm. The swarm is small. It's a very, that's the way, this is summer stuff, but that's the way cultural Marxism works, which is really Maoism from the 50s and 60s. But you have a small cadre of devout loyalists, and they're looking all the time for anything that subverts. And when they find it, they go. And that's that. And the more, Gina Carano is an example of this. Man, the ferocity with which they went after her was extraordinary. Absolutely. Now they're gonna pay the price because she's suing for a lot of money, and Elon Musk is paying for it. He's paying her her lawyer bills. But that she was a class, they cannot tolerate somebody on the inside who's not on the reservation. And so they swarmed. Gina Carano, she's a MMA fighter who became an actor. And she was in The Mandalorian, which is a Star Wars TV show. Very popular character in the show. And she said some things about, I don't remember if it was trans ideology or the Holocaust. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. And they fired her. And so now it's coming back. And then they didn't just fire her. And then because that's not how cultural Marxists are. They continue to hunt until you're extinguished. And so they kept coming. And then she finally said, they can destroy you. That's what they were trying. That's what they will do. And so she finally said enough. And now she's pushing back. Disney's being sued. Probably what everybody wants is discovery. They want to see all the materials Disney has. They don't care so much about the outcome of the case. They want to see what Disney has. Internal emails, because it'll all come out in discovery. And Disney doesn't want discovery of their internal stuff like that, because that'll be brutal if that gets to public domain. So that meaning would be that they would settle out of court. But I think Elon Musk is saying, no, we're not going to settle out of court. He wants discovery. After what he recently said about Disney. It's harsh.
Well, this is, I have a very, very radical acquaintance who is all about Disney, and she's not really welcome Disney.
There's more people, they're not hostile. Even, yes. Even that's an example of it, Vic, where very, very, I have friends like, friends-ish people, very, very left, but they're not lunatics. And what you're talking about with some of this with the identity politics issue is devout act. It's practically a cultish. It's practically a cultish kind of thing. And people don't really want to be most people don't want to be a part of that, but these people are so ferociously vocal and committed. I don't know what they're doing with their lives because I have to work. So I don't know what they're doing out on the streets at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, but anyway, we should probably get back to the Bible. If you came into the Zoom feed today to talk about the Bible, we're going to talk about the Bible now. The point of all this, the point of connection with what we were talking about, with everything we're talking about now is this statement about, contrary to the teaching which you have learned, do not turn away from those who are against it. And then where's that other statement about be wise. How did it go? Wherever it is about being 19. Yeah, right there. I want you to be wise in what is good and innocent in what is evil. So we're talking about the ever shifting morality of our times. And you may think you're sitting it out. You are not sitting it out because you will not be allowed to sit it out. And that's why these forces are going on after them younger and younger. If you want to know what kind of person you are in terms of like generationally, don't think in terms of, baby boomer, Generation X, millennial, Generation Z. Think in terms of the decade in which you were, let's call it 11 to 21 or 12 to 22. Let's go with that one. That decade is your defining decade, not your generation. For me, it's the 70s. I was 10 years old in 1972. I missed all of the 60s. So I'm not that. I'm more like a Generation X guy. But the 70s, think of the 70s, that's my defining time. And the 70s, objective morality was still a thing because modernity ruled. Postmodernity hadn't yet overthrown modernity. The 60s were going to change that, but it was going to take a while. And so, if your defining decade was the 80s, oh well, especially musically. But 90s, 2000s, 2010s, that to me is more of, so we talked about this last week. Think about the difference between somebody whose defining decade is the 2020s to 30s, 12 to 22 versus 2000 to 2010, 12 to 22, or 2010 to 2020. The moral framework, the moral shifts there are extraordinary in those decades. But it's accelerating. It's moving faster and faster and faster. Everybody's just desperately searching around for, there's the most ridiculous things now about who you are. Everything's about who you are. I have to find out who I am, and so you
Determine your truth.
you change your hair to purple, and you think you've changed your identity. Okay, it's going to be green next week, but okay, I said I was going to go back to the Bible, so now I'm going to go back to the Bible. Let's finish this off. We got all the way to here. We're at the end of it, 21 through, this is his wrap up, his farewell, what we think of as a farewell, but which is really a greeting. So let's read through this and finish this off. The grace of our Lord Jesus be with you. Timothy, my fellow worker, greets you, and so do Lucius, Jason, and Sosipater, my kinsmen, plural. I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. Gaius, host to me and to the whole church, greets you. So who's talking there? In verse 23, is that Paul or Tertius? Because Tertius has now interjected. So and he's going to disappear again. He's not ever heard from in the Bible again. Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you. We'll talk about him. And Quartus, the brother, or my brother or something. And then a repeat of the statement in verse 20, which we'll debate about, which we'll probably ignore. So let's stop there. So there's some names that he or them, they throw out. The letter was written as a group. There's more than just Paul behind this stuff. Timothy, like I said, I think is the co-author of 6 of Paul's 13 letters. So we don't know how he crafted these letters. So it's entirely possible, for example, that Paul wasn't the only inspired writer for Romans. In this case, we already have a verse, Tertius, in verse 22, that was written by Tertius in the name of Tertius, inspired or not. Inspired. So Timothy, we've met before. Timothy was picked up by Paul from Lystra on his second missionary journey. He was the one who had a Gentile father and a Jewish mother. He was uncircumcised. So Paul had him circumcised because he didn't want the Jews to see an uncircumcised Jew as he continued to travel. And you can figure out how it is that anyone would know that Timothy was or was not circumcised in that era. And that tells you something about the world in which they lived. But he was worried about it. That's Timothy. So he's going to be with Paul then from the second journey, near as I can tell, probably pretty much for the remainder of his time. If the second journey was 52 to 55 or so, or even longer, no, that's about right. Then he's been with Paul since 52 AD, which would be at this point 5 years. He will be in Rome with Paul during his imprisonment, I'm pretty sure, if I remember right. We're going to talk about that. If so, then you can extend that another 5 years. So Timothy was there to the bitter end, and then he will get 2 letters written to him later, just before Paul is to be executed, which probably will be his second imprisonment in Rome. We'll talk about that. If so, then he's going to have been with Paul for 15 years or something like that. Long time. Most of Paul, this guy saw a lot, probably planted a lot of churches. Paul was not a one-man show. When you look at the lists of names at the end of these books, he was not a one-man show, and he never meant to be. He was a spokesman, but he was not a one-man show. Lucius, Jason, and Sosipater, you have 2 or 3 Jews there. Lucius here is probably not Luke. That's Lucas. He's also not a Jew, Luke. But probably not the same person. These guys, like I said, these guys had Jewish names, Saul, and then a Greek name, In Paul's case, a Roman name, Paulus. But you see it here, there's a, what's the name of this guy? There's another guy, actually another better example would be Silas. Silas was with Paul on his second journey. He got imprisoned with Paul in Philippi. The ridiculous story about the slave girl getting the demon cast out, and then it cost them business and so forth. It's practically a comedy. But anyway, his name is also Silvanus, and he will write Peter's first letter. That's how they did things. So Peter the Jew, who probably doesn't write or speak Greek very well, he brings along a Greek-speaking, probably an educated Greek-speaking Gentile who will clean it up. So who's inspired? Peter, Silvanus, or both of them? Anyway, it doesn't matter much except that you can see that he's got Jews, he's got Gentiles, he's got Romans. Silas was a Roman. I think that probably, my own hunch is he wasn't the only one. Those weren't the only two. Some of these names are names which would indicate they were Romans, Roman citizens. This guy right here, particularly, Sosipater, forget the guy's other name. I don't think I wrote it down. 21. Oh, there was Sopater. There was a Sopater of Berea who left Athens with Paul at the end of his third journey. So, you know, he picks up this guy, probably goes back to Jerusalem with him. They head across the sea, get shipwrecked in Malta, end up in Rome, but you're getting insight into who was with Paul that he collected from those journeys. These are quick decisions for people. These guys, you know, if you were converted in Asia, Trophimus, for example, or went with Paul to Jerusalem, you weren't a Christian for more than a year or two. And you're dropping everything. You know, talk about Peter and these guys leaving all and following Jesus. Well, at least they were staying in the same territory, right? They were staying in Galilee. But these guys here, Trophimus, for example, he leaves behind his pagan life, whatever it was, becomes a Christian, and within a year or two or something, he's on his way to Jerusalem with Paul. That's leaving all, man. We don't know what he did prior to that, but you know, that's a big deal. So the disciples, when the Palestinian Hebrew disciples in Galilee weren't the only ones who did that. They're just the most famous. Is there a Jason? Let's see what we got for Jason. If you're into chasing the names down, there was a Jason who helped Paul at Thessalonica on his second journey. So if that's the same Jason, that's 52 to 55. So he now is accompanying Paul on his third journey. So it was pretty clear that it was Paul's intention that if he would pick some disciples and then they would continue with him. And you see that movement from the second journey. I don't think you see it from the first journey to the second one, but from the second one to the third one, you see that a lot. And then from the third one, like with Trophimus, there's this move now to, and Luke potentially, this move now to Jerusalem and then maybe to Rome. We also know Luke accompanied Paul to Rome as well. Not this Lucius right here. I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. That's all we know about him right there. Did he know the church? We don't know. Gaius, host to me and the whole church greets you. That's the Gaius from Corinth, which would be the second journey. He's collected him. But Gaius is a very common name. Is that necessarily true? Not necessarily. It could be, I guess it could be another Gaius. Very common name. Erastus is interesting. Calls him the city treasurer from where? Greets you. There's an Erastus in Acts 19, 21, 22, which will be the third journey. That would be Ephesus. No, I'm sorry, that would be Corinth. And it turns out there's an inscription for a city official that's been uncovered in Corinth about an Erastus from this time. So it's possible that that inscription is this guy right here. That's what moved us. And then Quartus appears and disappears right here. That's all we know about him. He's the brother. Paul does that sometimes. He calls him the brother instead of my brother. And that's the greetings at the very end. Anybody want to talk about names anymore? Beaten names to death. I'm mainly interested in how it pieces together the world of the New Testament and where these guys went. It's so full of color when you do it that way, and you figure out where these guys went and who was with who. You know, you can get much more novelish about this stuff. It's much more like a novel. And then his benediction, is what they're called. Now to him who is able to establish you according to my gospel, there's that word again, and the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery, sound very familiar, which has been kept secret for long ages past, but now is manifested, and by the scriptures of the prophets according to the commandment of the eternal God, has been made known to all the nations, leading to obedience of faith, to the only wise God, through Jesus Christ, be the glory forever. Amen. And that benediction is debated about whether it belongs here or not. However, sounds an awful lot like other words that Paul has said. Usually when somebody interpolates a passage like this, the grammar changes, the thoughts change. It's very different. You can see that at the end of Mark. It's pretty clear in that case. This one here, boy, there's a lot of clues that it's very much like Paul, right? So for example, just go back to Romans 1. So you got these phrases here. Let's do this. Let's go to Romans 1. 16 and 17, you know, think about, there's actually several of them. To bring about, his calling is to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles. The thing wraps up the same way. It's almost like a bracket. Let's see, to made known to all the nations, leading to obedience of faith. It almost starts that way and ends that way. It's like the whole entire book of Romans is bracketed by this opening statement about the commission to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles, then closing with the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles. So that's, to me, pretty striking. And then this revelation of the mystery, the chapter 1 starts that way, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures and so forth. You know, it's very, very, it's like he's revisited the intro, and he's going to conclude the same way. And then also this mystery stuff, which has been, you know, the mystery that was made known or manifested or made visible. That's very common. Very, very common construct in Paul. For example, Colossians, one of the great statements of this. 25 through 27. Let's see, that I may fully carry out the preaching of Christ. So the mystery, verse 26 right here, the mystery which has been hidden from past ages and generations, but has now been manifested, an English translation probably of the same word, to his saints, to whom God will to make known what is the riches of the glory, there's another word, of this mystery among the nations, which is Christ for the nations. And then you see that also popping up in this benediction.
Question about to the only wise God. So how does the two fit into that?
To him, to the only wise and true God, to him, comma, to the only wise, that is, to the only wise and true God. So it's a that is. He just simply starts over and resays it. He summarizes all of this magnificent genius right here. The wisdom of this that was accomplished through Christ in bringing the gospel to the Gentiles as wise. He is the wise God.
Okay, so the to him at the beginning and the to the only wise God hooks up with be glory forever.
Yes, that's that. I mean, if I was going to diagram this, which I could do, maybe I should have done that. Now, to him, and then you list out all the things that he says about him. And then parallel to it, to the only wise God, through Jesus Christ, be the glory. Yeah. This is, I think this is just a more succinct, he gets descriptive here and then he succinctly states it in verse 27.
And then also the word only. Why, and wise. Well, in reality, there only is one true God. But then they say to the only wise God, because people are trying to make gods out of whatever.
To the only God who is wise in the ways that I just described.
The other
To
God,
the only God.
Yeah.
Who is a wise God. I mean, yet he's not leaving any room for another God.
the other gods are not only foolish,
Idols are no gods at all. We don't have to wonder what Paul thought of that sort of thing. Yeah. This is highly Jewish. He's claiming the utter uniqueness and exclusivity of the God of Abraham. Here, he is the only wise God. It's not that he's better than, it's not that he's wiser than any other God. It's that he's incomparably great. He is by himself and he rules over a created order. There is the creator and then there is the created, and he is in the category of creator and status of creator, and everything else is creation. And he sits above as the wise God. That's what he's saying, in my view.
That's a powerful.
It's unbelievable. And I think it's also particularly captivating when you think of it as bracketing with the opening. You know.
Goes along with chapter 1, that statement kind of goes along with chapter 1 when, in the fact that, he talks about God being the creator, and then follow that up with that man tried to make themselves
Yes.
wise.
Oh, you know what? That's a great point.
Um,
I never thought of that.
So here it says, verse 19 says, because what may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but because futile in their thoughts and their foolish hearts were darkened, professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things.
So take a look at this phrase right here. The incorruptible God. That's about as fine a statement of the uniqueness, the categorically unique being of our God as you can get. That one right there. The implication being everything else in the universe is corruptible, including worship. Right? That's the whole point here, is their worship became corrupted. But in that case, all of this may be intro. This isn't part of argument, this is part of intro. And then he closes it off with very similar, you got this eternal over here. You have eternal God, where is it? His eternal power and divine nature. You have that similar reference right here to the eternal God. You know, so am I pushing it too far? Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, this is a manifesto of the gospel, the wisdom of God, and bringing the gospel to the nations, and in doing so, demonstrating his incomparable wisdom and power. And he closes with sort of glorying in that, pondering that. It's very similar to chapter 11. Very end. Remember this one? Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. And then you get that statement at the end about his superiority as the creator, for from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Chapter 16, very end. To him who is blah, blah. To the only wise God, very similar to chapter 11. be the glory forever. So there's another callback to earlier in the book in chapter 11. And that's it.
That incorruptible is really special because we experience corruption, all kinds of corruption in our lives, and it's so frustrating. But we never have to be frustrated with God because it's incorruptible.
Yeah, and it's not just physical. Paul is big on this in chapter 1. The mind is corrupted, and it corrupts. It is increasingly corrupted. There's this degenerative nature to the function of the moral framework. You see that right off the bat, right? In chapter 1, we talked about, probably too much to suit you, moral corruption, moral entropy is what I usually call it. The degeneration of the moral framework of the moral sense, which is what we're seeing in culture in our time, which can be fixed real quick with a world war. It's amazing how adversity resets things, shatters those illusions about reality and morality and truth and so forth, and resets you back to, oh yeah, okay, maybe I better go back to that, you know. But that's what you're seeing right here. You're seeing you see this is moral entropy right here in the second half of chapter 1. He gave them over, and in giving them over, you see this moral entropy, an increasing moral disorder. Things tending towards, I mean, it's a scientific idea, but you can apply it to the moral world as well. And you're seeing moral entropy. Things systems tend towards disorder unless an outside force acts on them to maintain the order, which you have in your own body. As long as you feed it and you give it these things, it will repair itself. You know, it will do things to keep itself ordered. When you don't do that, that's when you see physical entropy in your own person. But over time, it's the old statement from Omar. Hey Omar, how you doing? You remember what his answer to that was? Deteriorating right on schedule. From the moment you're born, you start deteriorating. Yeah, that's probably not right. What's right there? You grow, and then very early, you start to deteriorate. And much sooner than you want, you begin to notice it.
That's a very sobering verse. Did not see it.
Yeah. Yeah, think about this for our time. Celebrate it. We celebrate a lot of these things. Revel in it, Okay, good luck with that.
You
I think free.
I was just thinking, that kind of goes along with Jesus, we tried to talk to Jesus in Matthew, I think it's 9 or 18, I can't remember, where they come to him and says, well, Moses said it was okay to divorce their wife, and he said, no, it's not okay for you to divorce your wife. God only did that because your hearts were evil, and that's basically the same thing he was saying that Paul says here. God gave them over. Because basically their thoughts were it's okay. They think it's okay to divorce your wife. Just like Paul says, he gave over. God saying, he gave you okay. Basically said, okay, if you want to have, become homosexual, lesbian, or these other things that we have in today's world. It's basically the same thing Jesus was saying to the Pharisees that said, hey, it's okay to divorce. No, it's not okay to divorce. But it's just you did it because your hearts are evil. And that's basically what Paul is saying here. God gave them over to because your hearts are evil.
That's why you're responsible for it. I also, with regard to behaviors, behind behaviors is always a moral sense. Behaviors are an expression of mores, of moral values. And so every time for example, with LGBT, which you just mentioned, there's a moral framework behind that guides that. That's a moral framework. And our culture is now under the control firmly of an LGBTQ moral framework. There's no doubt about it. And that's why I use the term, that's why I included sexual identity and license. It's a moral framework of license. But a moral framework of license is always tends towards disorder, which is exactly what you're seeing in our cities right now. Our cities have been captured by moral disorder, by moral entropy, because the moral framework underpinning that worldview that controls these politicians and so forth is a worldview of moral license. And now it's been applied to just basic law and order. And so then what you see is exactly what you're getting in Chicago, Portland, San Francisco, and so forth. I'm a student of this. I like to watch this stuff unfold. It gives me a sense of where why are things the way that they are? Did people just go crazy? Well, or did they just buy into a moral framework that they thought was better at the moment because they get to do what they want without constraints? And now they're gonna pay the price because there ain't no going back. No, but you never go backwards. You cannot say, well, let's go back to 1950. Nope, you ain't going back. You're not going back to you're not going back to 2000. You're not going back to 2010. There is another thing coming, but it isn't going to be what we had in the past. It'll be something different. It might be better, but it's going to be something different from what we've had before.
That's why politics who heed God's word are so important, especially in local communities, because they're going to have a whole different mindset set from the world of politics. It's Christian helping the Bible.
Yep. And it's coming back. I'm convinced of it. It's going to come back, partly because the Christians aren't giving up. The homeschool front is kind of a leading indicator of that fight. Because really the homeschooling phenomenon is a subset of the evangelical Christian movement, but they're not giving up. And I'm relatively optimistic about that side of it. Anyway, that's Romans. We did it. We're going to do Philemon or Philemon or something like that, which is only once. We're not doing all of it. We're going to spend 1 week on it because it's so much more colorful. After you've been through Acts and Romans, you can understand some of what's going on behind the scenes. We have to talk about Colossae. If Paul never went to Colossae, why are there so many people from Colossae with him in Rome? Which becomes an issue. And I don't know whether he went to Colossae or not. There's no record of it. He didn't found the church in Colossae. But the question of whether he ever went there is another matter. And I don't know that either. But we'll talk about all those issues when we talk about that very short book. I haven't read any commentaries on it. I just want to make some observations about it that I think are really interesting.
Well, I taught that talking about it, and I think even in class.
They don't think he went there?
They don't think he went there. Because basically when he wrote the letter, he was actually in Rome.
Yes. Colossians?
And
Yeah, that's one of the prison
basically
officials.
He talks about how Epaphras is gonna bring this order back to you. And if I remember right, it does say in Colossians that he's never been to that church.
Oh, okay.
If I
Okay.
remember right. So.
All right. Yeah, like I said, I've never studied it, so.
It's been a while since I did that.
All right.
A few years, so I can't remember exactly.
I didn't have it in me to read 150 pages in the next week, so I'm not going to bother. But anyway, thanks for bearing through. We're done with this book. That's a great 1, 2, 3, Luke, Acts, Romans. So we'll move on to something else. We can talk about that next week. Who do I still have in this feed?
We're still here. Thank you, Gary.
Katie, how are you doing? Katie's out doing something. She's out working. She's out like with her phone or something. Yeah,
Robert and I are still here.
I see you. All right, well, everybody, thanks for showing up, and we'll move on from here. See you later.
See you later. Thanks.
Yep.
Adios.